There is a moment most people never truly forget. A moment where something changes in a room without anyone openly saying it. You are surrounded by familiar people. Friends, coworkers, family members. And suddenly something feels wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough to explain clearly. Just subtle enough to make you question yourself afterward. The smiles feel delayed. The energy feels colder. Someone interrupts you at strange moments. Someone changes the subject exactly when you begin speaking honestly. You leave the room replaying everything in your head, trying to understand what happened, trying to figure out whether you imagined it. But here is what most people never realize. Some tension has nothing to do with what you did. Some tension appears because your presence unconsciously forces people to confront parts of themselves they desperately avoid. And according to Carl Jung, that reaction is one of the oldest patterns in human psychology. Carl Jung believed that every person carries two identities. The first is the persona, the social mask. The acceptable self, the version designed to survive socially. Polite, controlled, pleasant, predictable. But underneath that mask exists something much deeper, something darker. What Jung called the shadow. The shadow contains everything people reject about themselves. Their envy, their hidden rage, their fear of being weak, their hunger for control, their insecurities, their resentment, their manipulative impulses. The parts they learned very early were unsafe to reveal. And for people who grew up around trauma, especially emotional neglect, psychological abuse, or narcissistic environments, the shadow often becomes enormous. Because traumatic childhoods force people to split themselves emotionally in order to survive. A child raised by a narcissistic parent quickly learns something dangerous. Love is conditional. Safety is unstable. Truth creates punishment. And authenticity becomes risky. So the child adapts. They become hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant, emotionally sensitive to every shift in tone and energy. They learn to read micro-expressions, silences, passive aggression, emotional withdrawal. Because in toxic environments, awareness becomes survival. And this is where Jung's psychology becomes deeply connected to what modern psychology calls trauma patterns. Because trauma survivors often become extremely perceptive adults, not because they wanted to, but because their nervous system was trained to detect danger everywhere. And the more perceptive you become, the more dangerous your presence feels to manipulative people. Not because you expose them publicly, but because manipulative personalities depend on emotional blindness. They depend on confusion. They depend on emotional fog. Especially people who operate through what many psychologists now describe as dark psychology, subtle manipulation, emotional conditioning, gaslighting, silent punishment, psychological control. These people survive socially by controlling perception, and when someone enters the room who quietly sees beyond the performance, something uncomfortable happens psychologically. Their nervous system reacts, because your awareness threatens the illusion they worked years to build. Imagine someone who spent decades creating a carefully controlled identity, the perfect parent, the loyal partner, the generous friend, the calm leader. But underneath the persona exists insecurity, control, fear, manipulation. And then someone arrives who is no longer easily manipulated emotionally, someone calm, someone emotionally aware, someone who no longer reacts predictably. That presence alone becomes threatening. Not because you attack them, but because psychologically they feel seen. And according to Carl Jung, people will often do almost anything to protect themselves from seeing their own shadow clearly. This is where projection begins. Instead of confronting their discomfort internally, the mind projects it outward. Suddenly you become the problem. You become arrogant, cold, too intense, too sensitive, too difficult. But the accusation often has very little to do with you. What they are actually reacting to is the mirror your presence creates. And trauma survivors understand this deeply once they begin healing, because healing changes something fundamental. When someone heals from emotional abuse, they stop reacting the same way. The old emotional buttons stop working. The guilt stops controlling them. The silent treatments stop terrifying them. The emotional manipulation becomes visible. And this completely disrupts toxic systems, especially narcissistic systems. Because narcissistic dynamics depend on emotional predictability. If they criticize you, you chase approval. If they withdraw affection, you panic. If they guilt trip you, you apologize. But healing destroys the script. And people who relied on that script become deeply uncomfortable when it stops working. This is one reason emotionally aware people often trigger hostility without understanding why. Because awareness exposes hidden dynamics automatically. Even silence can expose them. A calm nervous system can expose them. Strong boundaries can expose them. A person who no longer needs validation becomes very difficult to manipulate psychologically, and dark personalities experience that as loss of control. This is also why many survivors notice a strange shift when they begin growing emotionally. Friendships change. Family dynamics shift. Some people become colder, more passive-aggressive, more dismissive. And at first it feels confusing, because you are actually becoming healthier. But psychologically, your growth acts like a mirror. Your discipline reflects their avoidance. Your boundaries reflect their lack of self-respect. Your healing reflects wounds they refuse to face, and many people would rather attack the mirror than confront themselves honestly. This becomes especially visible in toxic families. Every dysfunctional family has invisible rules. Do not mention certain truths. Do not challenge the manipulator. Do not expose the emotional abuse. Protect the image at all costs. And the moment one person begins healing psychologically, the entire structure becomes unstable. The child who always absorbed everyone's emotions begins saying no. The peacemaker stops over-explaining. The empath stops tolerating disrespect. And suddenly the family calls them selfish, cold, difficult. But what actually changed is not cruelty. It is consciousness. And consciousness threatens systems built on denial. If this resonates deeply with you already, if you are beginning to recognize hidden patterns in your own life, subscribe and activate the bell. Because this channel explores the hidden psychology behind manipulation, trauma, human behavior, and the silent emotional dynamics most people never learn to see clearly. One of Carl Jung's most powerful ideas was something called individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole, not perfect, whole, which means integrating the shadow instead of pretending it does not exist. Facing your trauma honestly, facing your patterns honestly, facing your emotional wounds honestly, without hiding behind performance, without hiding behind masks, without pretending to be someone you are not. But individuation is extremely uncomfortable, because it forces people to confront things they spent years avoiding. Their insecurity, their dependency, their manipulative tendencies, their fear of abandonment, their unresolved trauma, and most people never fully do this work. Instead, they stay attached to personas, roles, social masks, false identities, which is why psychologically authentic people often create strong reactions around them, because authenticity unconsciously pressures others to question their own masks, and many people are terrified of who they might find underneath. This is why trauma healing changes relationships so dramatically, because healing changes your identity at the nervous system level. You stop surviving emotionally and begin living consciously. You stop begging for emotional crumbs. You stop tolerating psychological games. You stop confusing anxiety with love. You stop confusing emotional chaos with passion. And manipulative people immediately feel that shift, especially people skilled in dark psychology, because dark psychology relies heavily on unconscious emotional reactions: fear, guilt, shame, trauma bonding, approval addiction, emotional confusion. But emotionally conscious people begin recognizing those tactics in real time. And once awareness appears, control weakens dramatically. This is why some people seem irritated simply by your calmness. Your calmness tells them their tactics are no longer effective, and that creates psychological frustration. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse eventually realize something painful. Some people never loved the real them. They loved access to their wounds. They loved access to their insecurity, their empathy, their self-doubt, their need to be chosen. But once healing begins, the relationship changes completely. Because healthy love grows with your healing. Toxic attachment often weakens when healing appears. And one of the hardest parts of psychological growth is understanding this truth. Not every relationship can survive your evolution. Some relationships were built entirely around your unhealed trauma, your lack of boundaries, your emotional dependence, your silence. And once those things disappear, the connection no longer functions the same way. At first, this feels lonely, because healing often creates distance before it creates alignment. But over time, something else begins happening. The people who remain around you feel different, safer, calmer, more authentic. You meet people who do not require your suffering to feel powerful. People who are not threatened by honesty. People who do not punish emotional truth. And slowly, your nervous system begins understanding something new. Safety no longer requires pretending. This is one of the deepest shifts trauma survivors ever experience, because many survivors spent years believing love required self-abandonment, that peace required silence, that survival required emotional performance. But individuation changes this completely. You begin becoming psychologically real. And according to Carl Jung, that is one of the most important transformations a human being can experience. Not becoming admired, not becoming impressive, becoming real. Because people disconnected from themselves spend their lives reacting unconsciously, projecting unconsciously, manipulating unconsciously, hurting others unconsciously, repeating trauma patterns unconsciously. But conscious people interrupt the cycle, and interrupting psychological cycles always creates resistance at first, especially from people invested in keeping those cycles alive. So if you feel misunderstood while healing, if certain people become uncomfortable around you as your awareness grows, do not immediately assume you are doing something wrong. Sometimes your presence simply forces others to confront parts of themselves they worked very hard to avoid, and you cannot shrink yourself forever to protect people from their own reflection. What you can do is continue becoming more conscious, more integrated, more emotionally honest, and stop apologizing for the clarity that trauma forced you to develop in the first place.